Hey, this is Pamela Riemenschneider. I'm the retail editor for Blue Book Services, and I have Anne-Marie here, and we are going to talk about the latest sales numbers for some analysis that Anne-Marie is doing with IRI and the Produce Marketing Association. So we have the numbers for week ending May 3rd. How is fresh produce doing?
You know, first of all, May 3rd, if you think about it, we are now coming up on 2 months of this sales tracking and 2 months of vastly different grocery patterns. So 2 months is an interesting time frame in terms of developing new habits. So how did they do? Well, a whole lot better than some of those earlier weeks in mid-April. Not as good as last week, but I don't think we can complain about total produce being up 17.2%. We continue to see that split between vegetables tracking far ahead at 24% over the same week last year, and then fruit about 11% over the same week last year. So fruit still not as strong as we would have hoped. We would like to see it closer to that vegetable growth, but you know, we really cannot complain about double-digit growth at this point.
And some of the things we've been talking about that are challenging fruit are that fruit is for primarily when we talk about it, it's an impulse buy, and people are not being very impulsive when they're either shopping in the store or online.
Yeah, so if you look at the developments and how this whole grocery shopping thing has gone over the last 2 months, initially everybody was running from store to store to store to find all their toilet paper and whatever else they thought was necessary. And there was a very high trip frequency and a much smaller basket because people were just grabbing what they could at all these different stores. Over time, you see it flip. So there's way fewer trips, but a way higher basket. And so what is happening with shoppers is that they're shopping less, really specifically pick one store, and grocery stores right now, that particular channel is really benefiting, as well as Aldi and some of those value focused stores. They're grabbing a much larger share of total fresh, including produce. But when people are in the store, they're rushing through, they're really making sure that that trip is as fast as it can be, as well as covers them for the entire week until they go again. And I think part of that also factors into that continued strength that we're seeing in both frozen and canned.
Yeah, frozen and canned is kind of an interesting stat for you, because you've also seen different people entering the category as of late.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. So one of the things that IRI looked at this particular week was what we call panel data. So it's a little bit different than point of sales, and we can actually see a little bit more as to who is buying and what, where, and when. And so when they did that, they realized that within frozen fruit for those 4 weeks of March, there were 32% of the buyers that did not buy frozen fruit those same 4 weeks in 2019. And those 32% of new buyers to the frozen food category represented, we need to look here, 62% of fruit sales. Numbers for frozen vegetables, very, very similar. So in this case, it was 46% of frozen vegetables. So it's not just bringing new feet down that frozen aisle, but they're also representing very sizable percentages of that growth that we've been seeing on the frozen side. Same for canned. So there's absolutely a little bit more pressure and a little, just dividing up that dollar across really all produce zones in the store.
Well, the growth of frozen and canned kind of goes along with some of the things that we've been tracking consumers. I looked, and when you look at fresh produce and safety and things like that on Google Trends, when you track those search trends, the number one related query, the fastest growing related query to fresh produce, is coronavirus.
Wow.
So consumers are really concerned about the safety of fresh produce. Of course, there's a lot of campaigns, a lot of efforts to assure people that fresh produce is safe. Then when you actually tick down on it, we also have another stat that goes along with some of the things we've been talking about. It's fresh produce delivery near me. So people are also turning to online or turning direct to consumer. And you have some interesting stats about online, don't you?
Yeah, well, first of all, you'll have to teach me how to do that. The coronavirus, is it safe to eat fresh produce? That's fascinating to me. In that same frozen food survey that we've talked about before, we found actually that 15% of consumers said, I'm now buying frozen fruit and veggies because I'm a little concerned about buying fresh right now. So there is concern in consumer comments. We see things come back like have hand sanitizer stations, have more bags, maybe bag up the produce for me. What are all the different things that you're doing to keep the food supply safe? So that's interesting to see that that actually starts to pop up in Google searches as well. And I think that's a big part of our communications, regardless of where you are at in the supply line, to talk about the safety. Online, yes, huge jump. Data geeks like me, we talk about, there's a growth curve, and it had really slowed down for online engagement, where people were trying, but they tried it once or twice and kind of fell back out of it. So there was a hardcore, but didn't really stick with it. Well, now if you look at the growth trajectory and where we are at today versus where we thought we would be, it's 2025 now. A lot of these people, what we're seeing in numbers is if you have ordered online 3 times and you've invested that time to build your whole shopping list, and now you're starting to benefit from having your past purchases, your favorites and everything else, then all of a sudden that snowball starts to roll downhill and it starts to actually benefit people. Then they're starting to have more comfort. They're starting to order more fresh food, which typically initially are not in fresh baskets. So the longer this takes and the more orders will happen online, I think the more this actually starts to grow, including growth for fresh. And that is going to just drastically, you talked earlier about impulse for fruit. Think about the impact that will have on fruit sales, and how are you going to create impulse online? Think about the reason for ordering online. It's safety in stores, not necessarily convenience among those newer shoppers that are older than the typical millennial that was the online shopper. So just drastic impact, I think.
We even kind of kicked this around in our pregame a couple of weeks ago about some stores going dark to just make it even safer. And that actually happened at a Whole Foods store in the Chicago area. They've closed a traditional store and turned it dark to online orders only. So we're seeing retailers tiptoe, step around, pilot these programs to see if this is something they want to continue in the long term. And it just speaks to the strength of online ordering and the demand for it. If there wasn't demand for it, they wouldn't be closing an entire store.
Absolutely. And I think, the comments that I'm seeing come back from consumers, they're very fascinating in that they were expecting to have a bad experience with fresh and with frozen. And so often I see comments that say, oh, wow, everything was packed in a separate bag and it was still cold. With almost, you can just hear the surprise in their words. And the fact that the heavier items were packed on the bottom, and all this surprise with the quality of their online order relative to fresh. And so again, I think the more often people do it, the more satisfied their experience is, the more we're going to see this growth continue.
We've also seen some growth in different areas, and we talk about the numbers first. Of course, the sales numbers is the first reason we're here, but also we're kind of trying to pick apart the consumer, the new consumer, and how consumers are settling into their lives, compared to last year, compared to 6 months ago. And you sent over a really fascinating set of numbers from Profitero about a search index for home cooking categories. What's going on with home cooking?
So I thought it was fascinating. So, of course, as researchers, we all ask the question, are you cooking at home more? Well, yes, we are. 90% of shoppers say they do. Now, if you think about that, how does that impact breakfast and lunch and snacks and all these different things that we used to, at least in part, outsource to food service? And a couple of weeks ago, Profitero came out with a chart that talked about the huge spike in buying instant pots and air fryers and pizza makers, bread makers. And, just talking to friends around me, everybody is baking bread in their little bread makers now. But then this chart that you're talking about just shows me two different things. You know, we see gigantic, I mean, nearly a straight line up for things like kitchen bowls, I would think it was, knives. I mean, basic
Tea
things you
kettles.
to cook. Yes. And so to me, it shows, hey, yeah, so a lot of people weren't cooking before, because if you need to buy a bowl and a knife, then I mean, what kind of kitchen were you running? But it also shows that people are investing in those items and maybe starting to enjoy it. They're certainly engaging with recipe searches, tips on how to do certain things. So you know, if we can really make this a fun experience and a good experience, man, that can just really drive sales in for years.
For years, either that, or like I said, I mean, in 6 months when everyone's gone back to their normal shopping and eating patterns, I will find all of that at the thrift store when they donated to get rid of all this extra clutter.
There's that. There's that.
Either way, somebody's winning. All right, well, we will watch for next week's numbers. That will be week ending May 10th. I'm going to call it where we're going to see a little bit less, because everyone flocked to the foods restaurants for Mother's Day. I mean, especially around here, all of the pickup and delivery and takeout, and everyone was jam-packed. So I'm going to say that maybe there was a little bit lower sales, but maybe not. Maybe I'll be wrong. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll have to see. I mean, some states, obviously, restaurants are still not even open, not even with limited capacity. Others have started to open back up. I would agree with you that typically Mother's Day is a big eat out, spoil mom kind of occasion. I saw some retailers have some cross merchandising online with all the items for Mother's Day brunch. I thought that was fantastic, starting to take those in-store displays and putting them online. So we'll see whether Mother's Day provided a bump or not.
All right. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Pamela.